Well, we're continuing our series on African history, and I'm very, very pleased to have Peter Jones in Livingston with us today. As I said at the outset, I'm keen to try and find people out there who are going to tell us the truth about what happened rather than what people would like to think happened in Africa. There does seem to be a marked disparity between the conventional wisdom and the truth. And I think, well, I don't think, I know Peter is a purveyor of the truth. He's looked into this particular history very, very carefully. And another point that I'm excited about is the fact that Peter's an expert on the history of what was Northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. This is a country that not enough has been written about for some reason. And so there's a lot people don't know about what happened. And I know Peter can enlighten us. He's Zambian born and bred, born in Lusaka, grew up in Ndola, went to school in Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, in Rosawi, at Rosawi, and then went off to Sandhurst, where he was commissioned into the Royal Engineers. He served with 5 Airborne Brigade for a while, and then saw service in the Falklands, Uganda, and Northern Ireland, before completing, I think it's 10 years in the British Army. He returned to his homeland, went on the Zambezi as a rafter, as an oarsman, and then built the River Club in Livingston, which is one of the preferred destinations for tourists, and a wonderful place to visit, I know. So Peter, thanks very, very much for your time. And I'm not going to take up any more of your time. I want you to tell us about how it all started.
Sure. Thanks, Hannes. Good to see you this morning. Just to go back to what you were talking about Zambia's history, I think the reason that Zambia's history has been lost over time is because the name change of Northern Rhodesia to Zambia was so significant that many people thought they were talking about the Gambia, which of course is many miles from here, and that the word Rhodesia, everybody associates it with now what we call Zimbabwe. So people have forgotten the association. That's been part of the reason. And look, it happened to places like Botswana too. The name change was so significant. Same with Malawi from what they had been. But I think for us to understand Africa, and it's merely my perspective, it's a different angle on it, is there are many people in Africa who don't understand Africa itself. So I'm going to start from that particular point. And what a lot of people don't realize is the sheer size of Africa. Within it, you can put the whole of Canada or China. They're about the same size. Added to that, you can put in the United States or Australia, Argentina, Western Europe, and the entire subcontinent of India, all at the same time. It's massive. And a long, long time ago, I believe, the way I look at it, it fell under one of 2 outside influences. It either fell under the French or someone else. It's a little remembered fact that France dominated half of Africa, mainly in the West, of course, with a bit of Spanish influence. And to be perfectly sure, it's closer to Europe than it is to us, so we don't know much about it, and neither do I. So I'm going to be looking at the area between Cape Town and Cairo. And once again, you fell under one of 2 outside influences. You either fell under the British or somebody else. And the somebody else's were the Dutch, who had 3 areas in what we now call South Africa. There were 2 German colonies, 2 Portuguese, the Belgians in the middle, and the Italians had to go twice at the top. Now, amongst all of that, you've got thousands of African tribes. There are 73 in Zambia alone, 200 in Nigeria, 11 in South Africa, and you've got 54 countries on the continent. So imagine how many tribes we actually have. It can get very complicated again. So I'm going to try and unclutter it by likening it to North America. And why is this? Well, to start off with, often people left what they called old Europe to go to the New World, and they did so because of religious persecution. The Americans got the Pilgrims out of England. The South Africans got the Huguenots or the Protestants from France. And we in this country, we got the Jewish people. Several times over the course of history, twice from Lithuania, and then we became one of only 2 countries in the world not to refuse the Jewish people visas by restricting their numbers, getting out of Nazi Germany. The other country was, in fact, Morocco. And both Morocco and Zambia, Northern Rhodesia, were protectorates, not colonies. Many people just try and say that the whole of Africa was colonized. Well, it's a bit broad brush, because some were colonies and some were protectorates. And there's a very big difference between the two, and the outcome is affected by that. And we'll go through it a little bit later on.
Peter, if I can just interrupt you there very quickly. You make a very good point there. What people don't know about Botswana, what became Botswana, is the chief Cammo, who was effectively a king, I suppose, actually implored the British to come in and make his country, what became a country, a protectorate. It wasn't.
Yes.
It wasn't as if the British came in with guns blazing and said, "This is ours." They actually were very hesitant about moving in there. It was Cammo who needed protection from, amongst others, marauding Matabele impis, and that's why he wanted British protection, and that's where the word, this idea of a protectorate comes in.
Correct.
So I just wanted to.
I'll come back to it, because you can see why Zambia came into being as a result of that too. Quite correct. Okay, another way we were similar to what was happening across in North America is when people left old Europe to go to the New World. Many people went through one particular city that had been started by the Dutch. The Americans call it New York. We call it Cape Town. Another way we were similar to what was happening across in North America is when people left what they called old Europe to move to the New World. They often went through a city started by the Dutch. The Americans call it New York. It was New Amsterdam. And we call it Cape Town. When the settlers got to these new areas, they settled on the shoreline for a while. Then they moved into the interior looking for opportunities, adventure, and of course, reward for their efforts. And the Americans were sold the first bit of fake news a very long time ago when they announced this idea called El Dorado. It didn't actually exist, but it was very good marketing because it got people to move into the interior. They liked what they found, and of course they stayed and developed the area. In Africa, we had our same story, only this time it was called King Solomon's Mines, which of course was put in a book, and I think a couple of films been made about it. But it is based on a true story, and that is when King Lobengula of the Matabele tribe fled onto this side of the river, and he's buried the treasure somewhere in what we now call Zambia. We just don't know where it is. But I'll tell you one thing is, one of the places they did dig for it was the front lawn of my lodge. But I'll show you there's nothing there. Anyway, when these people moved into the interior, they often went with wagons, and they had to form circles with them, and sometimes shot back at people who really didn't want to see them there in the first place. Now, this happened in the United States, South Africa, and what was then called Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And these three areas became colonies, and they have the same following characteristics. They all had an aggressive invasion at some point into the interior by the Europeans. They all had a revolution against the British. 1776 in America, 1880 was the first of two Boer Wars in South Africa, and 1965 is when Ian Smith declared UDI across the border in what was then Southern Rhodesia. And remember that only two countries in the world declared themselves to be unilaterally independent from Great Britain, and they were the United States and Southern Rhodesia. In all three conflicts, the rebels wore something that looked like camouflage. The Boers wore sort of brown colors, and the Americans and the Southern Rhodesians wore green jackets with black buttons and hid behind trees and rocks and things rather cleverly. In fact, the American rebelling troops and the Southern Rhodesian light infantry were both related to the Royal Green Jackets of the United Kingdom, the 60th Regiment of Foot. The name used to be called the Royal American Regiment, with an officer called George Washington. In all three colonies, an army unit was wiped out by the local people in a battle. In the United States, it was the Battle of Little Bighorn under Colonel Custer. In South Africa, it was the Battle of Assangewana, where 1,329 British soldiers were killed in just one morning at the Battle of Assangewana. And of course, across the border in Southern Rhodesia, the whole patrol was wiped out by the Matabele at the Battle on the Shangani River. And all three colonies had something of a civil war. It's also interesting to note that all three areas were very reliant upon farming. And in particular, the United States and Southern Rhodesia were heavily dependent on something called Virginia tobacco. A huge amount of similarities. And here's the next one. To the north is a country that is generally much bigger, certainly with a lot less people, where everything was set up very differently. The United States calls it Canada. Canada is a dominion. The Queen is still the head of state. South Africa calls it Botswana. And of course, the Southern Rhodesians or Zimbabweans called it Northern Rhodesia or Zambia today, because both Botswana and Zambia, along with places like Swaziland, Tanzania, Malawi, Uganda, Nigeria, and a few others, were actually protectorates, not colonies. So what's the difference? Now, you've already mentioned Botswana. Let's look at it a little bit more closely. Botswana, size-wise, is bigger than Texas. It's bigger than France. It only has 2 million people in it today. So you can imagine how few there were back in the 1870s when it was called, as you said before, Karmaland. And the big problem actually were the Afrikaners alongside the Matabele. And the Afrikaners from the Transvaal were trying to encroach into that territory. And of course, the king did not want it to happen, but he hadn't got an army to be able to deal with the problem. So he got his trusted trade partners, the British, and he invited them to come through to assist in the matter. So by invitation, the British arrived and they sorted out the issue. They were given land along the border to stop the Afrikaners encroaching into that territory. So they didn't steal any land whatsoever. They gave them protection. And there are big blocks of farms to this day along the eastern boundary of what we now call Botswana. And they're still there today. All right, so it became known as the Protectorate of Bechuana land. There was no uprising with arms for independence in that country. They've never had a civil war. And right now, arguably, Botswana is the only financial success story in Africa because they actually lend money to the World Bank. They have no debt, and yet nobody ever talks about it in the newspapers. What the newspapers do will promote all the bad stuff about Africa, but they never promote all the good things which the rest of us really should be following. So let's look at Zambia. Zambia is also bigger than Texas. And before independence, it was called Northern Rhodesia. And before that, it was two zones of northeastern and northwestern Rhodesia. So there were actually three countries called Rhodesia once upon a time, each of them twice the size of England. And where I am now, it used to be called Northwest Rhodesia, which before that was called Barotse land. It's the kingdom of the noble Lozi tribe. And their king, known as the Letunga, still wears a British admiral's uniform given to him in 1902, and he hasn't even got a coastline. He moves around on this very beautiful barge. It's longer than a railway carriage, and it's paddled by 100 paddlers, the same way that kings and queens of England have moved around the Thames for over 400 years. It is beautifully built. And of course, the British associate, you could see that. And the other thing that he did was, as soon as he heard about the anti-slave trade, he engaged in it actively. So the British thought him to be a fine guy, and they started to do a deal. Anyway, before the British actually arrived here, the Letunga, or the king, had a problem because he had two Portuguese territories either side of him, Angola and Mozambique. And the Zambezi River flows from one into the other straight through his kingdom. And what the Portuguese logically were trying to do was to join the two colonies along the river to use it to save them having to sail via Cape Town every time they wanted to go through the other side of the continent. And the local king didn't want it to happen, but he couldn't challenge them. So he was advised to take on the British by the Kama from what was now Bechuana land. And the king invited them, and they arrived without an army, and they got the king of Italy to arbitrate between the kings of England and Portugal. And the solution was a very simple one: keep the kingdom intact. Remember, the Barotse land actually went as far south as Wangi. So it was, the river was definitely inside his territory. Anyway, the king could then control who went up and down his river, and therefore it became known as Northwestern Rhodesia. There was actually no uprising with arms for independence in this country. There were squabbles, there was political fighting, there was a bit of stone throwing. But the point with us is that only less than 3% of this country was owned by the settlers. So there was no fight about the land. It was just the political stance. And neither have we ever had a civil war. And Zambia was recently voted as the most peaceful country in Africa. Mainly, surprisingly enough, because we've changed political parties in power. Botswana never has. They've still got the same party in power. We've had several different parties in power. Mm-hmm. Now, to move along with the story then. Now, another way was similar to what was happening across in North America. Of course, is when people get to these new places, they're keen to show how much bigger and better they can do things. And of course, the Americans and Canadians have done rather well at this for the last 245 odd years. And 150 years ago, there was a race between the United States and Canada to build a railway line from east to west coast. Now, bear in mind, back in those days, it was like going to the moon. It was a huge undertaking, and many people wanted to get involved. Lots of people jumped on boats from Europe to get there. The Canadians got a little held up by the Rockies, and the Americans, well, they wandered off the track sometimes to go look for gold in the Black Hills of the Dakotas. But they got through to the opposite side, and of course, they opened up that continent to trade, which is what we see today. And some people made a lot of money, like Mr. Vanderbilt. He made an awful lot of cash. But that's entrepreneurship for you. We all understand it. What is surprising is that we in Africa managed to beat the North Americans at this game, and nobody knows it. But we built that railway line from Cape Town to Cairo. The incredible thing here is that distance is double the width of America. Now, we're talking about 1880 here. So to them, it was a bit like us trying to get to Mars today. They simply did not think it was possible. There's no way that people in Africa could beat the North Americans at this. It was on everybody's mind. It was in the newspapers. And of course, newspapers didn't come out to Africa or other places daily. So when you got a newspaper, you read it several times over and you absorbed all the information. So people knew what was going on. And there was much energy put into it. Many people jumped on ships and came down the coast of Africa rather than going to America this time to get involved in the project. Now, it was the dream of a man called, as we know, Cecil John Rhodes, and he gets a lot of bad press these days. But let's just have a balanced look at what he got up to. He was born in England as a very sickly child, and with the greatest respect to the country that most of us originate from, the weather is pretty awful. So he got out of there and moved to Natal, where in the hot African sun, he got better. Like so many in those days, he moved to a place called Kimberley, where they were mining diamonds. But instead of getting his hands dirty, digging holes like everyone else, he took a pump with him, and he pumped the water out of each hole the deeper they went. And rather than take money for the work he was doing, he took shares in each of the companies, and eventually controlled enough shares around the hole to control what was coming out of it. He then went next door and he bought a farm off two Dutch brothers whose surname was De Beers. And he set up a small trading company selling diamonds, and he amassed a fortune. Well, good luck to him. That's entrepreneurship as it happened in America. He then invested his money into two things. Firstly, a railway line, and secondly, education. He financed the building of Rhodes and Cape Town universities in South Africa, Rhodes Hall at Oxford University, and of course the Rhodes Scholarship, which was open to any man at the time who could write his name and had an opinion from the following three areas of the world. This will surprise you. Germany, the United States, and most countries in the British Empire, with one very obvious exception. And that was, of course, Great Britain, because he wanted the youngsters from around the world to come through to an English university, share the ideas amongst themselves, get on with each other, and avoid war. How sad it was when in 12 years of his death in 1902, we had the beginnings of the tragedy we now refer to as World War I, which is exactly what he was trying to avoid in the first place. Now, of course, there are people wandering around wanting to pull down his statue and burn books and get grumpy about it. They're entitled to. Let them do it. Let them run out of hot air. Because when that's all finished and done, then we bring Nelson Mandela on our side. Because before he died, Mandela linked his foundation to the Rhodes Scholarship. which makes a lot more sense than pulling down statues. You're getting grumpy when most of these people haven't even started paying their own tax affairs. Now, the proof for me here is that since our independence in Zambia, more than 70 Zambians have won that Rhodes Scholarship, more than 80 from across in Zimbabwe. I've spoken to a reasonable amount of them, and they all come up with the same conclusion. Anyone who leaves behind a legacy of education has to be a good guy. And you can't put it any more simple than that. We must remember, of course, that neither man was a saint in their earlier days, but education is such a gift to hand over, and that puts them into on the same pedestal. So let's have a little chat about the railway line then. At the time, it was the longest railway project in the world. There have been longer since then, of course. But back then, it was the longest, and everybody was following the progress. Now, what Rhodes was trying to do was to put a spine, if you will, up Africa, so you could move people and goods up and down the full length of Africa. He was not going to get involved in the West. That was French control. There was no need to go there. So any resupplying he was going to have to do on the eastern side. And there were 3 ports. It was Mombasa under the British, Dar es Salaam under the Germans, and Beira under the Portuguese. And in the middle of the continent were, of course, the Belgians. So there were a lot of negotiations. He had to get on with a lot of people to make it happen. Now, the railway line itself, the physical line, most of it comes from Britain. So just think of the logical decision then to ship it all down to Cape Town and start building it back to where they bought it from. It may have been better to have started in Cairo, because in 1850, they actually put a small railway line going down towards the south, but didn't get much further than, I think it may have been Aswan or something like that. But anyway, so they started in Cape Town. So the first thing they did was to go to Kimberley for obvious reasons. That was for the diamonds. Then they moved straight north into what we now call Botswana. And halfway up the country, they ducked to the right to go through to a place now called Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. And there in 1897, they built the world's longest railway platform. Now remember, that's like building Heathrow Airport in the middle of nowhere today. And everybody read about it, okay? Now they were supposed to go north through a place then called Salisbury, now Harare. But like in the United States, they found something they wanted. Only this time it was coal at a place called Wangi. So in the middle of Bulawayo, they bent the whole railway project to the left. And as they looked at the map, beyond it was Victoria Falls. So now they wanted to build a bridge close enough for the spray to hit the faces of the people on these carriages, which is quite a romantic notion for a guy just out to make money, apparently. Now, if you've been to Livingston recently, you've got the 2 hotels, the Royal Livingston and the Avani. That is where, logically, they should have built the railway line, because you could just island hop. Very easy. They're nice rocky islands, and you could have a good foundation. But they wanted to put in something to show the world that they could achieve what was thought to be impossible, and to build the railway line over the gorge. Okay, they wanted to beat the Americans and show what they could do with engineering. So they sent for a team of engineers from the UK, from a place called Darlington up in northern England, and they got on a ship with horses, and they came down the west coast of Africa to German southwest, now called Namibia. They got on those horses, and they rode them across the Namib Desert all the way to Victoria Falls. Not a weekend trip on a horse. They took the measurements on both sides. They got back on the horses and rode them back to the coast. They got on the ship and went all the way back to England, where they designed a bridge, and they built the whole thing out of metal, upside down. And you've seen it. It's got the parabolic arch, which gives it the strength. But the easiest thing to do is to put it upside down, so you had a flat road surface against the ground. And they checked it would all fit together. Then they stripped the whole thing apart, every single nut and bolt, and put it on a ship through the Suez Canal to come down the east coast of Africa to the most southerly port, Beira. And they put it on a series of trains to come through to the middle of Africa. And one of the draftsmen went on to go and design another bridge, which they put in over some little waterway in Sydney, Australia. Okay. Now, if you're going to travel northwards on this continent, you have to cross one of 2 rivers. The Congo is the second biggest volume river in the world, second in the Amazon.
I'm just going to interrupt you there. Just those measurements were absolutely spot on, weren't they? I mean,
they were. I'll bring it up a little bit later on, and I know you're going to show some diagrams as we go through it. it is quite fantastic. And the Institute of American Engineers regarded as one of the finest pieces of engineering ever built in history, even today, with all that's been achieved. And I'll come back to it because there's other distances and measurements that come into it. Right, so if you're going to travel northwards on this continent, you have to cross one of two rivers. The Congo is the second biggest volume of the world, as I just said. It's 4,700 kilometers long, and it dominates the western side of Central Africa, emptying into the Indian Ocean. And as we know, that whole area there is just still today called the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Or you must cross the Zambezi River. Now, this is the fourth biggest river in Africa. It's 2,700 kilometers long, and it's the biggest river that enters the Indian Ocean. And the area either side of it used to be called Zambezia. Now, incredibly enough, these two rivers miss each other by just 1 mile at the top of Zambia. So this continent is very nearly cut in two by these two major rivers. Now, the area of Zambezi was about to change its name because the young people were following Rhodes getting into the interior and buoyed up by his enthusiasm of the hinterland. And it became known as Rhodesia, from Zambezia to Rhodesia. And they were breaking all the records set by the Americans when it came to building things. All right. And one of them was that they broke the record of actually laying the railway track. And they averaged for a period of time at 1 mile per day for 300 days. Some days they hit 5 miles in just 1 day. The rest of the world were completely outstanded by this. They thought this was almost impossible. The problem is with that kind of schoolboy behavior, they hit the bridge site before the bridge arrived. And undaunted by the problem in front, they took apart a steam engine, they threw a cable across the gorge, pulled this thing over in little bits and pieces, rebuilt it, and kept going. They were 100 miles away by the time the bridge finally arrived in 1904, putting down track as fast as the British could supply it. They then strengthened the cable across the gorge, and they called it the Blondin Line. Back to marketing again, because back in the day, there was a man called Charles Blondin who was tightrope walking at Niagara Falls. Of course, it was in all the newspapers, how this daredevil walking across this tiny rope across those falls. And they called it the Blondin Line, I guess, to try and see if he would come over here to do the same thing. But I guess he was a clever fellow, because remember that Victoria Falls is actually twice the height of Niagara. So rather sensibly, he decided not to take take the fall, as it were, because it would have ended in a calamity. Anyway, they then pulled half the bridge onto this side, and they rebuilt the whole structure in just 14 months. Sadly, we lost 2 men in the process, 1 African and 1 European, hit by the same swinging girder. On the day before April Fool's Day, 1905, they found the whole bridge in the middle was, in fact, 1.25 inches too long. But they had already worked this one out, because at that time of the year, there's a lot of spray coming onto the bridge. And of course, at nighttime, it chilled the bridge, and the whole thing contracted to fit absolutely perfectly by the following morning. That's how they designed it. And as I said to you just now, the Institute of American Engineers still regard it as the finest piece of engineering ever built. And it just, you can't fault them for that. It's quite extraordinary. Anyway, it was open for business in September of 1905 by George Darwin, son of Charles Darwin. Again, huge marketing. Everybody knew about Charles Darwin. And one man apparently took out his pocket watch to see how high the bridge was, and he grabbed a stone. Unfortunately, he let go with the wrong hand and was left with a rock. But there we go. It's just, that's what you do when you all get excited about things. But the point here is, it was then officially recognized as being the highest bridge in the world at the time. Within a year, they built the world's longest bridge of its type at Kafue. And within 15 years, the end of World War II, they built Lake Kariba, the biggest man-made lake on the planet. So there's 3 bits of civil engineering that we were the world champions at. And that was just quite outstanding. Okay, so let's go back to 1905. The early settlers were living upstream in a very swampy area along the river, and they were dying of malaria because they did not understand what the local people did. And that was swamps, standing water, clean water will actually give rise to malaria. So they were very kindly given an area to live in on a little hill, which we now call Livingstone. It's named after the great explorer who, as we know, walked this continent for 32 years on 3 expeditions. And the total mileage he covered in that time was London to Cape Town. 3 times. Try that, 3 times. An extraordinary walk for anybody at this time. Anyway, as we all know, he came over as a missionary, but that wasn't his main reason for being here. Because, well, he managed to convert 1 person to Christianity. That's it. Because his focus actually was on the getting rid of the slave trade. And the facts remain, within 4 months of his death in a little village called Chitambo in the middle of this country, the Royal Navy shut down the slave markets in Zanzibar based upon the intelligence he'd been getting out over the years. And that's why Livingstone is the only town left in Zambia with a European name on it. These Zambians understand their history. They understand the positive influence that we've had in the area, and they're quite happy to remember those things in that way, which is very pleasing. It's not trying to rub out history. It's good history, and they want to keep it going. Anyway, look, having built this town, the settlers went back down to the river where they had just left it to build the town, and they built themselves a rowing club on a crocodile-infested river. It seemed sensible at the time. And within 5 years of doing that, we then hosted this continent's first ever World Cup of any sport. The first World Cup in Africa was not 1995 in rugby, it was 1910 rowing. People followed 2 sports back then. There was boxing and rowing. All right, and the boxing only got you in 1974, the thing called the Rumble in the Jungle between George Foreman and Muhammad Ali. But we got the rowing, and like today, World Cups are only held in peaceful zones. Now, I remember I was telling you, as you know, earlier on, that there was a struggle in Zimbabwe, and you had the Matabele uprising, and that's why it was not held on that side of the river. But what they were doing was promoting an expo, basically, to show what was being achieved in Africa. And clearly, the best side to do it was the peaceful side, where we'd been invited in here. And sadly, at the event in New Zealand, they won against the Englishmen, but we get our own back in the story a bit later on. Anyway, the following year after that, we then amalgamated the 2 regions in the north to form this big area called Northern Rhodesia, which forms the common-day borders of Zambia. And 3 years later, the railway project had to come to a premature halt because of World War I. Now, the sad thing is that after World War I, people then started to follow air travel, and they didn't follow the progress of the railway line. But let's just have a look at World War I, for example. Everyone seems to think that World War I started and finished in Europe. It didn't. So let's go through it. The first gunfire of World War I was fired off the coast of Australia, from a place called Fort Nepean. Trust the Australians to start it. But that is because they wake up 12 hours before the rest of us on a normal day. The first rifle shot of World War I was in West Africa, fired by a chap called Lance Corporal Grunchi of the Gold Coast Regiment. The first naval engagement between Germany and Great Britain was not in the North Sea. It was on Lake Nyasa, now Lake Malawi, in the middle of Africa, because the British got the news first that the war had started, and they sailed his boat around and shot the ship from underneath the German, who was a bit annoyed because it was still being fixed in dry dock. And the fact that they'd been drinking partners the night before. Anyway, the German rowed out to demand what was going on. They had a whiskey and got over it, and he was taken into captivity quite quickly. Now, the last shot of World War I was not fired in Europe on the 11th of November at the 11th hour. It was fired on the 13th of November in a place in the middle of Zambia called Chambeshi, because they couldn't find the German general to ask them to stop fighting. In fact, the news got to this country on the 11th in Livingstone, but in one town then called Broken Hill, now called Kabwe, they had such a party, they woke up 2 days later realizing nobody sent the message further on up the line. So the message only got the Germans on the evening of the 13th, and it was then passed across to the general who acknowledged it on the early morning of the 14th, and they only laid down their arms on the 25th. All right, so their commander was a wonderful old man called General von Letter of Warbeck, and with less than 15,000 troops, he actually held up 250,000 allies, 165 generals, and they never actually beat him. And the good thing is, Zambia in 2018 had a great ceremony where we brought the grandson of the general to this country to sit alongside the Zambian president to remember what happened in Africa 100 years ago. Anyway, Germany obviously lost all of its possessions at that time. Now, some of you also may remember The African Queen, the film. Great old film, black and white. Well, that's based on another true story from Africa, when the British sent out 2 naval craft, the HMS Mimi and Tutu, to Cape Town with Commander Spicer Simpson. And they were brought up the railway line, across the Vic Falls Bridge in great secrecy, and on into the Belgian Congo. When they ran on a railway line, they dragged the vessels through the jungle to Lake Tanganyika, where they took on and captured a much bigger German boat called the Kingani, which they humorously renamed HMS Fifi, which I guess must have upset the normal German. But there we are. That's the way life goes. Now, as I said, Germans lost all of their possessions in Africa at the time, and some bits went to the British, some went down to the South Africans. The Germans had stuck to the plan. The original plan of building a railway line was 4 foot, 8.5 inches. Well, we're busy trying to save money most of the time. We built it 3 foot 6. There were different gauge trains at the time, and you have to change trains. But what they did here, you could actually jump on a train from Cape Town all the way through to the Belgian Congo to the west side of Lake Tanganyika, catch a steamer across. Now you're in what was German East Africa. Catch the train from there through to Dar es Salaam, jump on a boat up to Mombasa. Then on Mombasa, you took the Uganda Railways through to Namasagali in Uganda. Then you jumped on a boat to go through to, to Khartoum. You then jumped on a small train across to a point on the further up the Nile, crossed the river again, and went up to Cairo. So between the wars, you could actually have taken a train trip from Cape Town to Cairo. You went on different trains, you went on a boat, and you probably went on a camel somewhere near the pyramids, because it looked nice for a photograph. But I think, given all the complexities and issues that they had along the way, the project was complete. But sadly, nobody was following it by now, because everybody was jumping onto aeroplanes to come out. Anyway, we then move along towards the Second World War. And the Second World War, everybody forgets about the role of Africa at the time. But let's go back to Australia, because they fired the first shots again. Only this time they fired at one of their own boats, but fortunately they missed. So what involvement had we got in World War II? There was actually a young man from Livingston who flew in the Battle of Britain. This country, amongst many others, raised a lot of money to purchase planes for the RAF. And in fact, although there were 3 Rhodesian squadrons, that's 44, 237, and 266, there was a squadron called the Northern Rhodesian Squadron, that was 245, in acknowledgement of the money that was raised. South Africa was having a hell of a time in North Africa at Tobruk. And then people once again forget about the role of the local people, because 2 very fine regiments from this part of the world, the Northern Rhodesia Regiment and the Rhodesian African Rifles, fought with great distinction, not only at the top of Africa, but also in the Far East. And after World War II, during the Malayan campaign. And those units are recognized as being second to none in the jungle warfare that they were doing. And many barracks in Zambia are in fact named after battlefields from those conflicts, places like Burma, Tagagan, Kahima, and other battles. I mean, so many miles away from Central Africa, but the Zambians will not get rid of the names. They understand the importance of history, and you've got to congratulate them for that. And that's why it's nice to drive around seeing that kind of history still alive here. Anyway, with the World War II over, we could then concentrate on another project which had gone around the rest of the world, and that was called federation. Germany began the idea in the 1870s. Then, of course, the United States and Canada have the same idea, and it's called federation. But we actually got our idea from the paperwork to produce this thing came from Australia. Australia's real name is the Commonwealth of Australian States. And so we formed the federation of what was then Federation of Rhodesia and Iceland, in what we called Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. But before that happened, we had a little sporting game to play where we get our own back against the New Zealanders. And we all acknowledge that they are generally the strongest team in the world. But the only non-test nation in the world ever to have beaten the All Blacks are the Rhodesians, both North and South. Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And we beat them in the first game in Bulawayo, 10-8, and we drew them in the second. And not only are we the only non-test nation ever to have done it, there are only 5 other countries to have achieved beating them in a series. And they are South Africa, Great Britain, Australia, and rather strangely, France. But not even England has managed to do this. So that is quite extraordinary.